bite while you were waiting. Just to check first, Rakesh, do you know if all our resource persons are in? Syed Bolton?
We have one recording, William.
That's Priyanka, yes. But are Syed and Gresnia?
I cannot find them.
Okay, look, we will, while we are waiting for Rakesh to check with regard to our two other panelists, as we move into this session, largely to say that this session, the last conversation was a pretty good one, very, very thought-provoking. It was on, for those who were there, for those who are joining now, this conversation was on detention and returns. And it was very interesting. We had a European perspective, a US perspective, but largely a perspective of how the notion of human rights and a humanitarian approach to people to detention is somewhere on being on the regressive kind of thing, and we are losing that humanitarian human rights perspective in the way systems are being put up now in managed migration that somewhere take away the sense of freedom and human rights. And it was very interesting to see how this is now even engaged, at least in the US, the context of the US, the role of the private sector in these places, and a very good perspective also on how sometimes charitable organizations, NGOs, civil society organizations are caught up in maintaining the system. So there was very conscious thinking of saying there is a need to move beyond this before this becomes the framing of it. I was shocked at the numbers that were put out, for example, in terms of the US, 500,000, close to 500,000 people every year in incarcerated kind of thing in different ways within the US for different periods of time. For us to seriously look at this in terms of start beginning to question how did detention, which is for immigration, whether it is economic migrants or it is crossing the borders, what some states call illegally crossing the borders, how have we lost that whole notion of borders being spaces of welcome, borders being places that facilitate movement among states, borders being places where people can approach to seek asylum. We seem to have lost that kind of perspective, and it is time for us to start looking at how the managed migration framework diminishes in some ways the whole concept of a humanitarian or a rights-based approach to issues that are definitely hard for states. Of course, you can't, we are not advocating for a kind of totally open border policy kind of thing, but definitely the need to have a rights-based approach to some of these programs is now the big question that we need to focus on. Having said that, we move into our next panel session, and this is our next session, which begins now, which is largely focusing on GCM Objective 8. And when you look at Objective 8 largely, to sum it up, talks about save lives and establish coordinated international efforts on missing migrants. Now, this is very real. Only last week we heard about something like 27 or so people died while crossing the channel between France and the UK, and we saw how this issue of borders and people crossing the seas and then go missing, how that has now become so weaponized that states are using this in so many different ways to criminalize almost migrants and people who are crossing or seeking alternatives to what has become a very difficult existence. GCM Objective 8 talks about that. It talks about a commitment to cooperate internationally to save lives and prevent migrant deaths and injuries through individual or joint search and rescue operations, standardized collection and exchange of relevant information, assuming collective responsibility to preserve the lives of migrants in accordance with international law. We further commit to identify those who have died or gone missing and to facilitate communication with affected families. Now, that looks like a very strong commitment, but how does that commitment translate into real operation? This is the big question. And we've seen in this last week how the UK was blaming France, France was blaming the UK. This thing was how in the Poland-Hungary border, the Polish were blaming the Hungarians not Poland, not Hungary, the border with Poland, which we saw last week, how that had become a big issue, and for Poland, and how that had become weaponized in a way, and now international media picked it up, and there was a lot of back and forth on that. This objective is about that. This objective is about people who go missing when crossing borders, international borders, and how can we work together and collaboratively in saving lives. So for this today, we had Rakesh. Any idea if our resource persons are in? Is Said Bolton in?
All are there, William.
Oh, fantastic. Said is just Said. Let me introduce them. Said first off. Said is a UK solicitor, and he has been involved in children's rights and refugee law. He has a lot of experience in legal practice on strategic litigation and in international advocacy. And since 2015, he has focused on the rights of missing and bereaved migrants as co-convener of the Last Rights Project. We also have with us Priyanka Shankar, who is an independent journalist, but unfortunately she could not go live with us. So we actually have a recording, a video recording that we will share with her, which our very own Paddy had an exchange with her. And Priyanka is an independent journalist, and you can see a lot of her work in Deutsche Welle, Al Jazeera English, the European podcast, etc. And then you have, I'm not going to pronounce this right, Drazina Branowaska, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Fundamental Rights in the Hertie School. She specializes in international human rights law. She has she has a PhD in international law, and before joining Hertie School, she was a postdoctoral researcher in the European Union funded project on memory laws in European and comparative perspective, and worked as a policy advisor on enforced disappearance in the German Institute of Human Rights. So let me start with you, Said, before I move to the others. Said, you have looked at this question, and I think from the biography that we've received of you, this is very close to your heart as a project. And since 2005, you've been working on this, the Last Rights Project, a co-convener of that. And we are looking at focusing largely on the rights of missing and bereaved migrants. From your perspective, then, in this recent tragic drownings that we saw just last week, can you tell us what went wrong where is accountability in this process, whether it is under international law or whether it is under kind of joint treaty between in European law? Can you walk us through what are the challenges there? Why did 27 people have to die? And this was an issue that was building. It's not that this happened quietly. This was an issue that was building. So the vigilance could have easily been there, or should have been there. That should not have, that these lives could have been, these deaths could have been prevented. If you can walk us through that first to understand where is negligence here. Said?
Can you hear me, William?
I can. Great.
Great, thank you. I've got a little bit of a strange setup because I'm on my phone and on my computer at the same time, just to make it work. But thank you very much for your introduction. And yes, it's as a project, the Last Rights Project was set up in 2015, although we've worked on issues very close to this for many more years. But the project itself came very much out of the very similar tragedies then occurring and still occurring in the Mediterranean. Before the Global Compact was signed, in fact, before it was completed in terms of its drafting, which we commented upon. What went wrong? Well, where to even start? I think what is most striking is that there haven't been more deaths or many more deaths sooner, given the situation arising between the UK and France. We can give some, and I think the simple answer is there's lots of international law, there's lots of human rights law, there are bilateral treaties, there are obligations contained in the laws of the sea, there's the Global Compact. Those mechanisms clearly haven't proved to be remotely sufficient to stop what many of us have seen as inevitable. And sadly, these are 27 more deaths, not the culmination of anything. Up until recently, I think the figures were that about over 14,000 people have lost their lives, and that's a very conservative estimate, in trying to cross international borders since 2014, when data was started to be collected in a more systematic way. So what went wrong? Well, I think we have seen increasingly, as you said in your introduction, arguments between states about responsibility, which have become increasingly characterized by the weaponization of migrants, rather than just a dispute between states about responsibility, such that we see the situation on the Belarus-Poland border, and we know that there are political drivers for the reasons that that tragic border is revealing itself. And the same between Turkey and Greece, and that entry point into the European Union, where the solutions, so-called, to that have not been about safe passage, but have been about increasing border security and putting in place what we would say, and many others say, and indeed courts have found to be inhuman and degrading reception conditions. So we see, not just in Europe, not just in the UK, we see this as a very long-running escalation of states of the weaponization of migrants and the acts of hostility rather than responsibility towards migrants. A lot of that you could characterize particularly within the Australian system of offshore processing and leaving people in abject, deliberately cruel conditions on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea and Christmas Island as a response to boat arrivals from Asia seeking refuge, often dressed up as a way of deterrence in order to save lives, but in reality, not saving lives at all, merely dispersing those dangers elsewhere. So back to the Calais and the UK situation, increasingly over the last few years, and I live near Calais, so I'm very familiar on a daily basis with what happens there. More and more perimeter fences, more and more security cameras, more and more technology used for infrared and X-ray searching of lorries and trains going through tunnels have made it almost impossible for anybody to come through on a land route now, such as it is between mainland Europe and the United Kingdom. So those who exploit refugees and migrants have set up an economic system, an alternative travel system, if you like, using inflatable crafts to transport them across instead. It was always going to happen. The argument between the two states, well, that continues at a diplomatic level. But we see, if we go to Global Compact, the Global Compact, and particularly Objective 8, that this is a joint responsibility to save lives and prevent harm. And whilst it may be justified in terms of trying to prevent people getting into the water, the actions of both states are doing nothing. In fact, we hear this week that the testimony of one of the survivors in one of those boats has said that they called for rescue, and the French said, "You're not in our waters, call the British." And the British said, "You're not in our waters, call the French." So we have a complete failure of responsibility there. So whether or not we have international obligations, those are not being respected by states who signed up to those obligations, either in the letter of the law or in the spirit or the moral framework of human rights.
Thanks for that, and I like what you've you've said about the mechanisms not being remotely suitable. You've talked about the inhuman and degrading human conditions. You've talked about hostility rather than reception, and this is all true of what we are looking at today, at what's happening at the borders. I'm wondering, the GCM comment tries to kind of rationalize this as if we don't know, and because today media has made this so visible, international media. So where were the GCM objective about adding more data and a kind of thing? How would data collecting in this situation, by giving us, data of, you said, for 14,000 since 2015, since data was being collected. I'm wondering, how is that data linked to advocacy or even relevant to advocacy today? And I'd like to know how your group, Last Rights Project, is able to make a strong advocacy for this.
Well, thank you. That's a very, very important question. And whilst we're too small to do meaningful data collection ourselves, we rely heavily on organizations that do. The International Organization for Migration has a project which is specifically about the collection of data about fatalities in migration, called GEMDAC, and has been very, very committed to developing not just use of statistics. Statistics can have a two-way impact, I think. It can shock you, but it can also inure you to the numbers. They become meaningless when they're high. Often an individual death is more shocking to people than 50,000 deaths. But nevertheless, we need that data, not just in crude numbers, but we need it in a way that is broken down sufficiently to understand where the biggest risks are, and then begin to understand what is causing those kind of deaths and injury in particular areas. But as you say, as an advocacy tool, if we can't have accurate information, then the basis on which we assert that states are not doing enough, or indeed causing the problems themselves, is a little bit undercut by the lack of empirical evidence. What I would say about data is data in this context has to be supported by the understanding that every life is an individual and every loss is that individual and family and friends and communities grieving. So the reductive process of data, I think, has to be guarded against, and that data used and illustrated always by the reality of how people died, not the numbers that died. One is too many every time, but we would like states to do much more. It's left to international organizations like IOM and other activists and groups to try to keep account of what is happening as an accountability and as a justice tool. Because without those numbers, and these numbers are inadequate as it is, justice is denied individuals, the truth is denied to individuals, and impunity is derived by states and those who act on their behalf, and indeed those who operate the alternative economy of smuggling and trafficking, are all rendered immune and have impunity if we don't use data as part of the evidence that produces the history of what happened to people who died.
Look, thanks for that, and I know that you've raised a significant kind of rationale for this for data. It does help us respond to the situation, and I've looked at the work of IOM on missing migrants and the collecting of this data. I agree with you. It is important, but I think it will have to be to civil society groups in making a case that something needs to change here, because we have seen in recent years these kind of numbers growing, and I think the advocacy is not there yet. It's nowhere close to saying what needs to happen, and that is why till today states are at this where the blame game of like we saw in this most recent one, the UK blaming France, France blaming US. So that is one angle that states take. The other angle they take is very quickly talk about the trafficking networks kind of thing. And these are traffickers and we must stop the traffickers. And they don't look into the reasons why people would take that risk. If you saw the dingies that were carrying people, anyone filming that, anyone seeing that knows this is a high risk thing. So why would people risk that? I think that question is not being dwelt enough upon in a collaborative, collective way kind of thing. And maybe we would find solution. And that is why I would like, what do you think are next objectives when it comes to Objective 8? What are the next steps kind of thing that we need to do in this Mitolini Declaration as well to change this reality? Because there are too many stories in the last 3-4 years that international media have covered of people just dying at borders. Isn't it time that this narrative changed?
Yes, it is absolutely, and I think the idea of a border, borders are relatively new in the global history. People were historically, before nation states, much more able to move freely across different geographical regions, and communities mixed much more fluidly. And indeed, in some parts of the world, we see the way that refugee protection is offered is in a much more flexible, fluid way across borders where in Africa, for example, many millions cross borders and are offered protection, de facto protection, if not status determination, because they're able to walk across to join communities in other countries and typically then return eventually after hostilities. But I think what can we do? What's the next step for the Global Compact? I think we really need to look more about the not deterrence, but responsibility sharing among states. I think this is the compact ought to be the first step in a positive dialogue, not something that was signed to be dishonored almost immediately. So we need to move to a more honest dialogue about how do we prevent harm and death through responsibility sharing for refugees. If we've created such dangerous situations, whether that's the nature of the journey itself or those who enable those journeys, then we need to think again. And there are people who have proposed new arrangements that maintain and honor existing international law, like the Refugee Convention, where we see status determination being done much more closely to the point of leaving one's country of origin, and countries agreeing to share the responsibility for resettlement and housing refugees. I think we also need to look more honestly about migration. And a lot of migration regimes, the UK's particularly, but others, are almost impossible for people to utilize for sort of work purposes, education purposes. Family relationships are split. So there are no viable migration visas realistically for millions of people who look to the long-term education of their children. They look at the ingrained poverty in the regions that they live, their health and their life chances. And the barriers are much too high. We know that regions that have been destabilized, like Libya, were once key work migration routes in West Africa, where people worked in Libya, learned skills and trades, sent money home, came home. Once that regime was toppled, and I don't make any comments about that regime, routes to particular economic outlets dried up for millions of people, and they had to look farther afield. So I think we have to look at these global compacts hand in hand, where the migration compact has to accept a much more liberal, flexible system for enabling people to obtain short-term visas, to be able to come and go. People don't want to be alienated from their own countries and their families. They want the privileges that some of the West have taken for granted for many years, that we can have a visa, we can get on a plane, we can go and visit our family, we can work for a few weeks somewhere. That's not that's an unobtainable luxury for most of the planet. And I think too many in the West see that outsiders, as they might see them, are trying to gain an advantage, are trying to get a visa in order to establish themselves permanently. I really don't think that is the situation for so many people. They want equality of opportunity on the same terms as people in the countries that they see enjoy all the benefits and lifestyles that they're deprived of.
Thanks a lot for that side, and I like again what you have. I like the way you've talked about borders in the way of speaking of it as a new phenomena. By referring to Africa and talking about how people cross there across villages and things like that, and how these are not permanent features. People after some time even return when the conflict has eased up or something like that. Then there is that sense of return, and it puts a very good perspective of how borders need to be kind of facilitation spaces. And I like that concept that you have put out there, kind of thing. I also like how you've come around to as a solution putting this issue of GCM Objective 8, linking it up with GCM Objective 5, which is about regular pathways, which I think Cecily has also doing, although she says there is an undermining of the human rights framework, but for God's sake, let's just be human, and which is your kind of perspective, which you're saying there are different reasons why people need, while people are crossing borders, and that is simply for opportunities and to have that equality of opportunity, which is again a fundamental human right. So thank you for that very kind of perspective, which calls for a different thinking around borders and sovereignty issues, and how and the whole question of missing migrants who because they want to cross this end up losing their lives. And like you said, one life lost is just one too many every time. So thank you for that. Let me. The other point I like is responsibility sharing, and be real about responsibility sharing with regard to the GCM objective. So that's really good. I don't think we have reached there yet among member states. There is a lot of fuss about dialogue, but there is very little genuine sense of responsibility sharing. Good point there that you raised. Let me ask Rakesh let's move on to the next kind of speaker, who is Priyanka. And I know that Paddy has done a video with her because she was not able to join us. Maybe this would be a nice time to share that video. All right, perfect. It's coming up. Go ahead, start. I'm not getting any sound. Rakesh, Sada, is there sound or?
Rakesh is trying, I think. Just
Is it okay?
We had no sound, Rakesh.
German name, and I think that most of us know www.com.
Give me a second.
Al Jazeera English, the European.
It's there now.
Are we Europe?
No, I think I have to change the browser. Give me a second.
All right. Yes, here we are today, and we are looking at
Is it okay now?
Compact for Migration on saving lives and
Yes, it
coordinated
is.
effort in terms of accounting for the missing. And I'm really privileged and glad to share this space here today with Priyanka Shankar, who's an independent journalist that's currently based in Brussels and has been working around migration, human rights, and press freedom. Her work has featured in DW, because I won't try to pronounce the German name. And I think most of us know DW.com much more better. Al Jazeera English, the Europeans podcast, Are We Europe, the Solutions Journalists Network, among others. And outside the newsroom, you will find Priyanka rambling about mountains and scuba diving. Priyanka, we are delighted that you could join us for this webinar, and thank you very much for taking your time for us to have this short conversation that we hope that our audience there will find enlightening. So let's go, just straight on to the questions. And, one of the questions that we have had as part of this, the Global Compact for Migration, and alongside many other efforts that are happening at a regional level and other efforts that are happening at the global level, you sort of see this convergence of ideas, or this convergence of, let's say, energy, nations, regions coming together to deal with problems that are related to migration governance. And for instance, the Global Compact for Migration outlines objective number 8, where it says, okay, yes, fine, let's go ahead and let's do something about saving lives, and let's also have some coordinated effort in terms of accounting for those who are missing. But we wanted to hear from you, Priyanka, as a journalist. What do you sort of see as the disconnection, let's call it a disconnection for what it is, with the ambitions that you see at this global level, and that you have read about at this global level, and your experience of covering different incidents that are related to migration? And you can touch on any of the ones that you're more comfortable with in highlighting to us the kind of disconnections that you see. Priyanka.
Thank you so much, Patty. I think it's really great to be here and hear about your project as well, which is really inspiring. And I think when you say disconnection so most of the stories that I've covered have mainly been from the Mediterranean and Greece and in Samos, which has a big refugee camp where a lot of the migrants come in from Middle East and Asia, crossing through Turkey. And from their end, a lot of the stories that I've always heard is that they come in, they apply for asylum, and then they're stuck waiting for really long. Because they either face asylum rejections, they're either being deported to third countries like Turkey, which EU countries say is safe, or it's just a very long process. And then after you listen to their story, the next level is like you talk to the NGOs who are trying to help them apply for their asylum applications, or human rights lawyers who are working with them. And according to a lot of them, there's a big disconnect with the fact that in the EU, there's a common asylum system, but the problem is in implementation. There are 27 different ways of implementing that common asylum strategy. And I think that is creating a big problem in asylum or in asylum applications. And it's kind of made the migration crisis even worse, because of course, in the case of Europe in 2015, it was something new. It was something they'd never seen before. Leaders were scared. And then they started to get a grip of things. Like, of course, local communities immediately help. There are, for example, in Greece, people are more than happy to help. They've done a lot. But with more and more people coming in, they're also confused how to do it. So I think the main disconnect that I would say is a problem of implementing the strategies that are made or the things that are discussed upon. And that comes down to politics, right? Because each government, some of them, I would like talking to human rights lawyers, it's been said, they say that there is a bit of an anti-refugee narrative in some places. In some regions, they are just overwhelmed with applications. They don't know, there's no consensus on how to deal with it. So I would say the biggest is implementation in disconnect. Yeah.
Super. And also just thinking a bit about some of the experiences you've heard from refugees and migrants. So let's just take one more minute on this one in terms of saving lives. I mean, we do see, journalists and, media houses have gone all out to share a lot of information of what dangerous journeys these look like, from boats to crossing dangerous rivers in some parts of the world, to crossing very dangerous, even jungles or even wild national parks in other parts of the world for migrants to make those kind of journeys. Is there, from what you've heard from some of the migrants and the refugees that you've met, is there really a sense, so at the global level, we have this language, yes, there's these coordinated efforts, the focus is to save lives. And that's the emphasis, that yes, people take irregular migration journeys, but regardless of the nature of the journeys, the emphasis is that we will save lives. Do migrants really feel that governments, whether it's their home governments, the transit where they are, wherever they're found in a place of danger, or the destination that they're heading to, do they have this sense that there's actually an effort to try and save their lives?
Oh, that is a tough and very good question as well. I guess I'll take the story of one of the migrants I recently met in Greece called Nemat, and he, because he's from Afghanistan, and he actually fled 2 years back, even before the recent crisis in the region. And I mean, he's been waiting for asylum status with his papers constantly getting rejected. And I think I asked him, I mean, he was, of course, fleeing conflict. He was a teacher in Herat, the Herat province there, and he has a little young girl, and he had to flee because the Taliban wanted to marry his daughter, who was just like I think she was around 12 at that time, and he was just like, I would not let that happen. And because I wasn't letting that happen, they said that, you have to be, you can't work here anymore. So he took the dangerous journey through Turkey, went through mountains, came into Greece, has been waiting for asylum. He did get it, actually, literally a month back. But I think for him, his main thing is that he just wanted a better life, and he was very optimistic. One thing he told me is everybody here, whoever he's met in Europe, has always helped him. But it also came because of his attitude. He said, he's like, I'm a very positive person. I want a good life for my children. And in the refugee camp that I'm in, there are so many of them who are depressed because they're waiting for paperwork. There are children who are not being educated or studying, and that's not the attitude you should have. So I think from him it was interesting because he was just so positive about everything because he had fled a trauma of a different kind. So Europe was that where he felt that people are actually here to help. But also the search and rescue is becoming something that is also being criminalized now, because in the same island of Greece, there have been like 3 humanitarian workers who went up on trial last week for search and rescue missions because they were rescuing refugees drowning at sea in 2018. And last week, their trial started in Greece, but they've already done like 108 days in prison there. But, the charges weren't dropped yet. It's been pushed to another court. And that has become it's not just search and rescue. There's even journalists in the region who are being monitored for covering migration and refugees, which is coming again from a very political narrative where it's like, okay, we have taken enough refugees. Now we can't help, or they're criminalizing humanitarian work. So I think, sorry, what was the last bit of the question there?
Oh, but I think you tried to cover that, to cover the response in a way when we were talking about, is the feeling then of, then migrants really feeling that this is the space where their life is being, is there saving life?
I think all of them,
migrants.
Well, for them making it to Europe, and I think after the journey that they've been through, when they've come into land, they just instantly, most of them want to move to and get opportunities to work. They want to integrate, they want to do something. And like Nemad said, he said, I want to follow all the laws. I want to earn, I want to pay my taxes. I just don't have the means to do that. He got asylum status last month, and he's now been left out in the blue. He doesn't know how he can educate his daughter because there's no system for that's come up after that. So it's kind of like they are positive, they want, but they're not getting the help they need at that stage, I guess. And I guess it is very complicated, like we discussed before. I think the whole aspect is complex. So we'd have to talk to each of the parties involved, which is the refugee in this case, the locals who want to help but are also scared to help now because of government being like, we can't help everybody. We can't. Pushbacks coming in from the government, the NGOs desperately trying to do their work, but they, at the end of the day, the rule comes from one political leader there who it is becoming harsher, definitely. Maybe this also has to do with the ghosts of the 2015 migration crisis in Europe, where they weren't used to seeing so many people and they're scared that it's going to come up again. So there's also that aspect.
That's interesting, and I think we'll cover it also a little bit later on. And you touched my next question. You kind of touched on it when we're talking about, what do migrants actually talk to you about, what the root causes are for moving. So maybe you can just nose in a bit and tell us a bit more. And maybe in answering that, it would also be interesting to hear, when we hear what migrants and refugees say about their their reason and their motivations to move. And then at the same time, what they're meeting at the borders. So maybe you can kind of combine these two examples. And I know you've done work around, Afghan migrants and refugees, and also maybe talking to us a bit more about the Mediterranean examples as well. You've talked about border surveillance, pushbacks, weaponization, basically, of migration. That's one side that you see. And then the other side, you've got this need for a humanitarian approach for these migrants. So, and then the root causes. So it's not like you've got a choice to head back. What's really happening to migrants around such a space?
I mean, like I said, a lot of them are either fleeing conflict. Some of them are also coming because of for family reunification reasons, but they're taking these dangerous routes because they don't have the means to apply for a visa, because a lot of them are coming from countries like Iran, Iraq, Syria, where there are also visa issues, so they take this dangerous route. And all of them are calling, I mean, it's not just them, it's even like migration lawyers, humanitarian workers who are constantly calling on safe and legal pathways for visas. What they mean is to give them the option to just apply for this in a legal way so that they don't have to come in this dangerous journey. Some of them literally just want better opportunities so they can earn and support their families back home. Because I remember I met this Iranian man in Greece 2 years back, and I asked him, so as soon as he saw me, he was like, "Oh, you're from India, and I'm going to take my mother there one day." And I was like, "Oh, how come you've come to Greece?" And he basically wanted to earn in euros so that he could take his mother to India for medical treatment. She lives in Iran, and medical treatment in India is cheaper. So he did this whole going around the globe journey, and his reason was basically he wanted to come for economic purposes. Some of them feel that Germany and UK is a good standard of living. It's good for their families. It's good education. They want their children to be better educated. So it's different reasons why they want to come, and but a majority of them is they're fleeing conflict and trauma, and their homeland isn't safe for them. So they look towards Europe for a better and safer life, I'd say.
And then maybe our last question, and maybe you can touch on, here, I think one of your most recent articles is looking at the incident that happened in the English Channel. And maybe it would be interesting to get a sense from what you experienced in covering the story, sort of, the narratives that you were able to gather together. And in talking about this, I have an interesting question for you in the role of the media. So, what do you think then, when we say that the media can play a very important role, obviously, in the space of migration governance, but we've also seen the media playing a role in politicizing particular issues. So what role could be played in humanizing and not objectifying issues that are related to migration?
So I'll go with your first question. So I think, well, there's been a migration crisis rumbling on it was the Mediterranean very much from 2015, and more in recent times it's been in the English Channel, and of course with the eastern border bloc of the European Union, where the migration crisis with Belarus. And both of these have been because of at least the one with Belarus was a geopolitical crisis. The whole, it became migrants being used in this geopolitical war between the EU and Belarus, and it's still they're still being treated like puppets in the middle, being pushed around, and it's really sad because they didn't sign up for this. It was just an easier, safer route for them to come this way, is what they thought. But that's something that I think even the EU is trying to figure out. Belarus is also like now they're sending people back. But with the English Channel particularly, that I think a lot of people in Calais, there's this NGO worker I spoke to. She runs a program called Conversations in Calais, which basically documents conversations between NGO workers and refugees. And she was telling me that this channel crossing is something that the deaths happening was not uncalled for. It's something that people knew that it's going to happen, because every day there are a lot of people who want to go from Calais to the UK, mainly because there's the language factor. English, most of them coming have like a lot of ties with the UK. They come from countries like Iraq, and other places in the Middle East which have links to the UK. Then also in Calais, the living conditions aren't as great, which is the case in the UK. They, it's probably a little better, and there's a lot of police brutality and racism in Calais. So they want to basically move out from France and go towards the UK for a better life. And I think what happened last week was very unfortunate, and the instant response that we saw was like, it just became this whole political spat, and it's still continuing. Even as we talk now, it's like France and the UK are like, we will, it's your responsibility. And it's really sad because people are still crossing, and they shouldn't have to still keep crossing. There should be like a proactive solution, but it hasn't come because it's politics that's at play. So I guess, the response of that has been critiqued a lot, because it's become a sort of a war narrative to some extent. It's kind of like, between the UK also, there was tension with Brexit. They've left the so-called Dublin Agreement of the EU. They can't really cooperate with other EU countries like they used to, but they haven't really come up with a solution of their own. They have like this whole borders bill, which is discriminatory, and it goes against, even international humanitarian law. But it's still, they're still blaming it back on France. So it's something that's not yet got a solution, which is really sad, which a lot of rights groups are pressurizing them to do. And the media, when I still remember, I got the breaker from BBC, and it said, certain number of migrants crossing have been killed or something like that. And instantly I remember I went on Twitter to like check the news, because it was 7. I'm in Brussels, and it was like around 6:37 that I saw the breaker on my phone. And instantly on Twitter, it was the news of this, but also a lot of journalists themselves criticizing the breaker, being like, it shouldn't be migrants, they're not a threat. Like the way the breaker was sent out was kind of like, oh my God, these people coming to our border have now died. They're people. And this journalist from The Guardian, she actually called it out, and she said, research has shown that referring to them as migrants or a supply of influx of migrants, using these terms is very dehumanizing. They're people, they're not a supply, or they're not a supply of goods. They're not a threat. They're coming because, they're coming because they're fleeing conflict or trauma, and they just need to be given the chance to apply for asylum. And there's been, at least since last week, even on the next day of writing stories about it, at every level of editorial thing, the response and being very conscientious of the term that you're using. I think even the Preeti Patel, the UK minister, she acknowledged and talked with that British Parliament, where she was like, I'm going to talk to BBC and other media outlets on how they address migrants. I mean, it's important, because it is people we're talking about. It is their lives and their stories. So definitely, I think one of the migration experts I spoke to, Bram Strauss from the Mixed Migration Center, he made a really interesting point. He was like, as soon as you refer to migrants as weapons of weaponization, or you refer to them in these terms of like influx or instruments that are being used to tackle geopolitical tensions, you're stripping away their agency, or you're completely dehumanizing them. And I think it's the media, it's political leaders who've been doing that, and that needs to change.
Priyanka, it's been an absolute pleasure to have a conversation with you about this, and we hope that we can hear more from you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Wow, thanks for that, Barry, for that video, because it was very enlightening. And I think there's so much that is common to what Said said earlier as well about the human story and what we see in the chat as well, in the human story of people at the borders and what they are either escaping. And it is nice that how Priyanka brought real life stories kind of thing to the conversation of what people aspire for, and what they struggle with and why they cross, and how there need to be a greater sense of political will and political solutions that to implement the disconnect between policy like the GCM Objective 8 and what is actually happening on the ground. I think that's very important. It's a good. That was a very good conversation with Priya. And now let's move. We are close to our time as well, but I'd like to talk to Dresna. Who I can't pronounce the name. Please help me pronounce your name. And I'd like to ask in your own work, as you have seen kind of thing, you focused a lot on international legal obligations regarding missing migrants and how that translates to policies at the national level, adherence to policies at the national level. In your critical reflections from a human rights and humanitarian perspective, what really shapes the practice of the EU members as well as other international organizations? And how could they be held more accountable to the desirable scenarios that are described in GCM Objective 8?
Thank you so much. It was really fascinating to hear the two discussions before. So I will try to, and we'll definitely come back to them and to some questions in the chat as well. So let me start with the very term missing migrant, because one of the questions in the chat also concerned that. And from legal perspective, well, the term is not defined. So who we call a missing migrant is really up to us. But so kind of, in my opinion, what would, and probably for the families, what would be the most useful way to use missing migrants is to all people on the move whose fate is not known to the families. So that would be kind of the broadest and most useful kind of from a humanitarian family perspective approach to the term missing migrants. However, kind of the numbers that we have on missing migrants are basically the numbers that are proposed by the IOM Missing Migrant Program, which is a very fascinating and well-functioning project run by the IOM. And they define missing migrants much more narrowly because it's casualties on the borders. So the numbers missing migrants that we use very often in official discourse, they do not cover all of the migrants that are missing. They only cover the casualties that have been found. So many more migrants are missing, in fact. And because this group missing migrants, when we approach it in such a wide way, it also covers different areas of international law. So we would have international human rights law, and here specifically enforced disappearances. If a migrant is a victim of an enforced disappearance, then clearly there's a number of obligations from the state, in particular EU member states. Many of them are also members, have also signed the International Convention on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. And here also support to families has to be provided. So this is kind of really strong obligations. Then if there is another human rights violation, IATR also comes into play. There's also law of the sea, it has been mentioned by Sid, humanitarian law if somebody's fleeing armed conflict. There's the perspective of children's rights, which also comes into play. So there's really many areas of international law that provide obligations that are also different. But then there are some obligations that are the same, no matter the reason and the perspective why somebody's fleeing. So one clear obligation is the obligation to identify remains that are found. And here is really a disconnection and international obligation and what is happening on the ground, because there's many many proof that not all bodies that are found at the borders of the European Union are identified. So this is a clear violation here. Then another really clear violation, and this is not only in international law, but also in basically any domestic law that you could look at, is the obligation to search for person that reports have been filed, to look for them. And here we can also see that with regard to migrants, in particular, if they're regular, states are at times even not following their own domestic law. So a couple of weeks ago, there were two boys that were first apprehended by the police, and then at the Polish-Belarusian border, and then they were pushed back, and a missing kind of a file was, a motion was filed, and the police just did not accept it, which is a clear violation of the domestic law as well. So kind of some things are, but there is a disconnection, which also comes from many different places, and we could see different reasons for that. So I don't want to go over time too much because we're already at 5. I'm looking at my notes that I was, so one interesting thing that was also mentioned by Sid concerning the waters and Great Britain and France kind of discussing who's supposed to help. This is exactly the same situation we have seen for years in the Mediterranean, where coast states were saying, no, this is not our waters, it is your waters. I guess kind of the height of hypocrisis has been reached on the Polish-Belarusian border, where a number of people were held kind of hostage between the two lines, and Belarus was claiming they're on Polish territory, Poland was claiming no, they're on Belarusian territory, and this was relevant because if they were on Polish territory, Poland would have to accept the refugee applications. So here there was not even water, it was really like on the ground, and here the two states were kind of pushing each other whose territory they are on, and eventually Amnesty International did an investigation and found that they in fact have been in Poland at some point and then pushed back to Belarus. So let me stop here to discuss more.
Yeah, thanks a lot. But can you tell me how to pronounce your name?
Yes. So the Polish version of the name is Grażyna.
Grażyna. Okay. All right. Thanks for that. And look, and Said, you might want to think about this question as well. You have both, all three of you have talked a lot about the politicization of what's happening at the borders. You've talked about the weaponization of what's happening at the borders. You've talked of a protectionist kind of perspective on the borders and things like that, which in a certain sense, this borders has become a place where migrants kind of congregate, let me say. And this place is now this place has become a deadly space to watch out for kind of thing. And I'm wondering, even as I was listening to you and Said started by that as well, about talking about international framework and the law of the seas, as for the longest time, we watched movies on the law of the seas and how it was implemented, Hollywood movies for that matter kind of thing. But we are now looking at a different time. And I find that in this time where so much is being politicized and weaponized kind of thing, I would like to say, what do you think if we were to have next year in May, the international community is coming together to talk about its review of the Global Compact. And in this review, they're going to look at what they've done in terms of implementation. In the current political time, the compact doesn't seem to make sense sometimes, because you are right. There's so much, like Priyanka said, there's so much of a disconnect between that discourse and what's happening on the ground. So what is the solution to getting back to implementing what is said at the policy level? How would any reflection on what we should be doing as we come in preparation for this review to bridge that gap at least?
To me, from a most practical perspective, I think there would be two issues that I think would be worth raising. So kind of the first, which is most obvious and also probably most radical, is reminding that the best way to prevent migrants losing life and to save lives and to prevent migrants going missing is to provide safe routes. And kind of repeating that and bringing that out there is really kind of the main point. And this is political. So this is kind of a political claim, but I think it's really worth kind of highlighting that part. And from a more practical perspective, something that would, because it's not that I think that in the spring states will somehow decide now to provide safe routes, but what actually can practically be done is supporting states, both receiving states and states where migrants come from, predominantly, in supporting the families in this search. And there is a lot of really good research and experience on how to support them, how to make that efficiently, and that could be really used, and promoted, and could really help with regard to those migrants that are already missing and their families who often for years or decades are really looking for them, and which puts them in a more precarious situation. So I would say that would be, in my thing, kind of two points really to push forward. With the first one, really, I know being radical and kind of not that practical, but worth raising.
Thanks a lot for that. And yes, like Said said, I think it is important. I like what you've said also of trying to understand from where migrants are coming and see how to be supportive within that context. I think that's going to be a very important focus in terms of international cooperation, even as we just saw now the big climate conference happening. I think one of the big discussions of the future is going to be how do we open up more pathways kind of thing for migrants in different contexts as they move. Sai, do you want to come in on this? What would be a way of narrowing the gap?
I think I echo what Grzina says, but I would probably I would add to it by saying that safe routes, yes, of course, safe passage from the theatres of conflict and persecution are essential. But I think trust and confidence and consistency in the way states apply their migration criteria so that they can be better trusted as well as more accessible is absolutely imperative to making people think that if they go through regular channels, then they will be treated in those channels with compassion, not cynicism. It will reflect their own desires for migration and the ways they want to migrate and use travel to other countries rather than a kind of transactional system that states decide what work shortages they've got and set the barriers for people. I think it must be a much more open, two-way arrangement as to what migration means to the majority of people. Secondly, I think, and I'm going to plug the Last Rights work here, that one of the things that we really use as an advocacy tool is what we called it in shorthand, the Mitolini Declaration, which is a document containing, based on very well rehearsed international human rights law principles and humanitarian law practice, the absolute minimum standards needed for the dignified treatment of missing and deceased persons and their families as a consequence of migration journeys. And I think within that document is an expression of many of those things that should be the content of those meaningful statements in Objective 8. And indeed, I think in 2018, when we shortly after we drafted that document, there was a joint open letter from the mandate holders of the Human Rights Council's special procedures system calling for Global Compact Objective 8 to be understood and applied consistent with the provisions of our Mitolini Declaration. So that's just a plug for that, and we can put that on your materials or website for people to read without me going through it in the time available. But also, I just want to say, I think one of the important, two more important things that we should be thinking about when we go back to discuss the Global Compact. One is not just the weaponization of migrants and refugees, as we've seen, but the attacks also on civil society, solidarity groups, organizations, lawyers, and even judges who speak out and act in defense of migrants. We've seen a systematic attack on civil society, and it's almost as if the border is a place that has been cleared out of anybody who is not sympathetic to the sovereign powers of the particular state. And I think we need to reopen this dialogue, possibly in the same way that we saw the Paris Agreement, the COP27 meeting, that many of civil society are excluded and the state claims the territory of discussion. I think we need to insist as a civil society and advocates for full participation in these discussions, because otherwise, for all the fine words in these compacts, they will only be articulated.
And then they did not also add movement on Mimosa. And the movement is not also on Mimosa. So, sending mission.
They will only be articulated through the prerogative of states and the priorities of states. So that would be one principal call for next time. And I think finally, the other one is accountability. We've talked a lot about human rights without really labeling things in this very good discussion. But I think we need a stick as well as some carrots. And I think that the Global Compact should be something that is set into human rights periodic reporting from all states to address what they have done to realize and implement the obligations that they've signed up to in the Global Compact. This may be soft jurisprudence in some sense and not something that is easy to enforce, given that it's a cooperation agreement. But I think we can use it to set standards, and we can use it to ask the question of states. We've seen in the first round of reporting back from countries on how they're implementing the GCM that, particularly within Objective 8, it's been very narrowly construed, really about search and rescue at sea, when it is so much more wider than that, that it is about all those people who are caught up on borders, land or otherwise, and not just at the border, prior to arrival, being left in limbo, no man's land, and uncertain status afterwards whilst decisions are being made. So I think we need states really to understand the full obligations set out in Objective 8, which includes, as we've discussed a little, the looking at the rights of bereaved families, not just in terms of search, but the dignity of the deceased, how their bodies are cared for, where they're buried, who gets access to the body, repatriation, who is funding all those things, visas to come to mourn and grieve. One of the things we haven't touched upon, I'll finish after this, is the implications of a pandemic and a post-pandemic world, where we're seeing new barriers being erected between those who've had vaccinations and are able to travel about and have basic freedoms through vaccination passports, and those who haven't even yet had a vaccination. And so the use of quarantine as an extra method of detention and an extra reason for not rescuing or not disembarking people in distress. I think we need to go back and understand that states are already using pandemic measures as a means of immigration control. And I think the Global Compact must be understood in that context as well.
Thanks a lot, Said. Thanks a lot for that. Grazina, you want to come back? 10-second input?
10 seconds. So kind of touching on what Sid said, I really, I would like to mention a policy by the Ethiopian government for looking for missing migrants, but only those that are regular migrants. And kind of that also shows, so you could apply for this scheme to look for your loved one if the person has left in a regulated way. And this really kind of shows the problem of shifting between the two. And this is also an economic issues, clearly. So there are, I think it's really important to remember that every approach that we take needs to cover both regular and irregular migrants.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. And just to say in conclusion that I really like today how the two of you have actually, we hear of the Global Compact, and we speak of it as a definitive document when we say it is the most comprehensive document. But today in the conversation, both of you challenged GCM8 by opening up the whole conversation on what do you mean when you say missing migrants. And both of you said it's much more than what it is currently being defined as. I think this is something that has not come up. We have taken it for granted that missing migrants is this numbers that are collected. And I really appreciate the way both of you unpack that and saying there is much more to missing migrants than is currently being defined. And we need to look into that. I love how you come back to a real value system, a human rights-based value system of trust, confidence, and consistency in the way we treat migrants, kind of thing. So I really like the comment of the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights with regard to using the Mitolini Declaration when it comes to GCM8. I really like that quote because we will definitely use that in our own advocacy as we engage in the preparation for the IMRF. And definitely, I think this whole framework that you are talking, I think it is a very important conversation. It's going to become a bigger conversation. This conversation has only started on missing migrants. The world, and I like how you ended side as well, is there is a lot more precarity. There is a lot more fear. There is a lot more of struggle and pain in the lives of people to which they seek other options today. And we are going to see a lot of this kind of thing unfolding in our world as people choose opportunities to cross borders, to aspire for something more than what they have. And I think we need to have a different perspective on this. Thank you so much for challenging the perspective that is currently defined. Thank you also for saying what is out there that we can use and must use because it is there, the policy frameworks. If they are not being implemented, there is that lack of political will which must be called upon and called out for what it is. And thank you for saying that the solution is about understanding and getting back to a value-based system of living. Thank you so much. Thank you to our folks in the chat box who have echoed similar thinking and ideas. And I'm sure we'll have you on for other conversations as well. Just like to say, this is all part of a grassroots approach in addressing. So staying connected and staying informed among ourselves will be key to seeing how we can challenge policymakers to do the right thing. Thank you all for being part of this today, and see you again next week. Thank you.
Thank you. William, just a very short one to thank our panelists, especially, to both of you really, for just being brilliant at showing up for us. We apologize again for the login connections, and maybe to remind our students once again that we're meeting again on Saturday for the unit for the lecture. So Saturday lecture, and Tuesday we are back again, and now we'll be diving into the world of smuggling, and the following week on trafficking. So we continue, and thanks again for your active participation. Grazinia and Sid, thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you very much. It's been a
Thank you, William. Fantastic moderation as usual.
Day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night.